Thank you. I think I could set Jamie's monologue to music. Were you listening to that cadence? Wasn't that wonderful? I've been speaking about atheism for 25 years now. I think I've done my penance. I only preached for 19 years. I guess only is a strange word, but ever since 1984, when I spoke publicly for the very first time about my atheism, boy, was I nervous. And the venue for that was not some church, of course. It was not a humanist meeting. It was the Oprah Winfrey Show. I had just come out of preaching, and 9 months later, her producers called and said, we want to do a show about somebody interesting with atheism. I had never spoken publicly before any group before, much less a hostile audience. As a clergy, I was so used to audiences being so loving and appreciative, and here I was now denouncing everything I had formerly believed. That was 25 years ago, and I have to say, in all that time, this is the largest group of atheists I've ever had a pleasure to talk before. How did you do it? And look at this. Did any of you have to be here? I mean, you wanted to, but are you afraid of hell? Did some organization tell you you have to come to this thing? Are you trying to gain brownie points in heaven? Isn't it amazing that this movement, this atheism, which actually is a non-movement, because a movement needs followers, right? And none of you are followers. We're all our own leaders. We're all egalitarian. Isn't it amazing how organically it just spreads up because we want to be? And the student groups are another example of that. Forming all over our nation, all over this country. I had the pleasure of meeting are some of the student group leaders here today? Some of you university people? Yeah. What I think is amazing, nobody's making them do that. Students are poor and they're busy, and a lot of them say, we got to fight back. We got to do something. And a lot of them think they're the only ones in the world. They form their group and then they realize, oh, there's more of us. It's this, what Phil Zuckerman calls, and Gregory Paul calls, a kind of organic atheism. Not from the top down, but from the people themselves thinking, deciding on their own voluntarily that this is important to me and this is why I want to be here. When I did my debate Thursday morning at Macquarie with Cardinal George Pell, whose name I had never heard before, but when I mentioned it to some people, I mentioned it when I was in New Zealand. There's some of the New Zealand humanists here today as well. Somebody said, oh, he's a disaster. And I thought, well, maybe I could use that word. Who is this guy? And then when I got to Sydney, somebody said, you're debating George Pell? He's an imbecile. And I didn't know if I could use those words until after I met the man. But I have to say that out of all the things that happened, I was criticizing God and the morality of the Catholic Church. He really didn't like it when I mentioned things about Mother Teresa. But I think what bothered him the most was being treated as an equal. He called me Dan, and I call him George. His Eminence, the Most High Cardinal, all these honorifics. The title of our debate was, Without God, We Are Nothing. And I thought of saying to him, George, maybe it's true that without God, you are nothing. Because what does he have? Did any woman vote for him for those titles of his? How many people voted for him to be cardinal? Not very many. Isn't it just the Pope that appoints him? So all these titles, all these Roman costumes that he gets to wear, all that stuff, would vanish without faith, without religion. 5 or 6 years ago, if I wanted to buy a book about atheism in my local bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin, where would I look? Where would you go to find a book about atheism? Maybe, yeah. True. You go to the religion and maybe philosophy and you poke around, oh, there's one, and maybe there's... But today, I can go into the Borders Bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin, and there's an entire shelf with the word atheism on it, with about 20 or 25 titles, including Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris and Dennett and all the big heavy hitters, and a lot of other wonderful books written by a lot of people whom we've had the pleasure of interviewing on our radio show, Free Thought Radio. And I understand some of you listen on podcasts down here. So I think that was I'll have to tell Annie Laurie to be careful what we say about Aussies on the show. But I had a book in 1992, Losing Faith in Faith, that tells my story, from preacher to atheist. No publisher wanted it. No distributor wanted it. So we've been selling it just through our organization, an in-house thing. We publish it ourselves. We sell it ourselves. We put it online, and it's done okay over the years. But a couple of years ago, a publisher came to me wanting to get on this wave, I guess, of atheist popularity. Isn't it nice when the publisher comes to you and said, could you bring up to date your book about your story, because a lot must have happened in 16 years. So I did. It's called Godless, How an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists. And there was some mix-up about the book signing, so there's only one copy in the room, and this is it. Maybe what I could do is get all your names, and I'll sign all of them on this. But it was a real pleasure that Richard Dawkins agreed to write the foreword to the book. And he says that, and I agree with him, there's a lot of wonderful writing and analysis of religion from the outside in, but rare to find something from the inside out, to find someone who's been there. And some of you in this audience were like me, weren't you? You were true believers. You prayed, you felt the Spirit of God and all of that, and then you came out on your own. And how did you do that? And I'm going to tell you briefly how I did that. But in the wonderful foreword that Richard wrote, he says, is kind of repeated there, and you tell me if this is a compliment or not. Dan Barker is the most eloquent witness of internal delusion that I know. A triumphantly smiling refugee from the zany, surreal world of American fundamentalist Protestantism. Dan was not just a preacher. He was the kind of preacher you would not want to sit next to on a bus. And that's true. I was that guy. Have you seen that guy around ever? Out on the street corners, on the park benches, knocking on doors? I was that guy. I knocked on doors. I thought the world was ending any minute, and you didn't know it, you poor, lost, blind heathens. You didn't know it, but you were secretly starving for the wonderful message that I had, that I was going to. It was your lucky day when God directed you to sit next to me on the bus. Really. After a little bit of talking, a chit-chat, I would look over at you and say, excuse me for saying this, but I can see that you really have some deep struggles in your life, don't you? How does he know? I got to tell you, the tactics of evangelism are crude and simple and transparent and embarrassing, but they work. If you want to be an evangelist, just do it. If you want to be a missionary, just do it. It works. There's all these people out there that are susceptible and gullible and wondering, and they see somebody like me who's confident. I know what I'm talking about. I have answers, and I'm religious. Most people go, oh, maybe I don't have the answers. Maybe he does. I would look over at you and say, you know, you're struggling with a personal relationship in your life right now. How does he know? And I know I used to feel the same way you do, and you're wondering about what's it all about? Why are you here? What's the meaning of life? What happens after we die? What is your purpose? Where do you fit in? How do you make sense of it all? I used to feel that way, like a ship without a rudder, and are you just trying to go day to day? Well, I felt that way too, but I have an answer, and the answer is Jesus. Thanks for laughing, but most people don't. I rarely had any doors slammed in my face. I rarely had anybody come back at me with any informed criticism. Where were you guys? I could have used a little bit of that. Maybe I did meet some atheists, but you just kept your mouth shut out of respect, right? Well, don't do that. I don't mean you should be disrespectful, but say something. If nothing else, say, I respect your opinion, but I disagree. If nothing else, say that, so that I would know, that we would know that there is disagreement out there. You don't have to get in a big, long fight. In fact, sometimes it's better not to, right? But just let it be known. Now, wear your Richard Dawkins Foundation A pin everywhere you go, and people will ask. Someone finally asked me what it meant. It was one of the guards at the Canadian in Toronto at the airport in Canada. What is that A for? And I said, it's for atheism. And she went, oh. That was it. But I mean, that was, that was better than nothing. A little, I guess, maybe once an evangelist, always an evangelist. When I was 15 years old, I was sitting in a church meeting with an altar call and a call to the ministry. It was a charismatic church, and I was feeling the Spirit. I'd already been born again. I'd already prayed to Jesus to forgive me of my sins and to make me born again, all that. But what am I going to do with my life? What am I trying to, what do I want? And there's the verse they preached, to go into the whole world and preach the gospel to every creature. And I thought, yes, that's what I want to do. That's where I'm going to fit in. And I felt this amazing thing inside. And I prayed in tongues, and I can still pray in tongues, actually, and I won't do it here, but it's embarrassing. But you know what? It works. I can still pray in tongues right now, and every once in a while, every year or two, I'll try it just to see, it doesn't wear off. And as an atheist, I will close my eyes and I will get goosebumps. I will feel this presence it's like a father figure right here talking to my brain. It will be like this peace that passes understanding, this sort of integration and inner joy that almost brings tears to my eyes. And it's a very real thing that happens with some people that are on this end of the bell curve of susceptibility to mysticism. Some of you don't know what the heck I'm talking about, right? Some of you went to church and you're looking around going, huh? Well, but some of you know what I'm talking about. You're over here on this end of things, and I wasn't psychotic. I wasn't hearing actual voices. I wasn't insane. I was a smart guy. I wasn't crazy. I was deluded. It really is a delusion. But it wasn't that I had lost my senses or anything, but this thing happened in the brain, and I accepted what I was convinced was a call to the ministry, and I started preaching when I was 15. And I carried my Bible to school. I was instrumental in my Spanish agnostic high school teacher becoming a born-again Christian. And he and I started a club where we were ministering to others. I went down into Mexico. I went on missionary trips and evangelical trips. I started playing the piano in churches. And I've got to tell you, there's an on-fire, talented young person in any religion, they put them up front, right? They want the young people up there to try to encourage others to join. So I was always out, almost every night of the week, preaching. And I wasn't very sophisticated at first, but, out of the mouth of babes, preaching the gospel. I became the choir librarian for Catherine Kuhlman, who was one of these big American faith healer, kind of tent revival faith healers, who was very popular for a long time. And I sat right by her. Like on the stage, I was about 6 or 8 feet behind while she was doing her faith healings, and people were throwing away their crutches, and people were crying, and it's in the name of Jesus, you are healed. And people were, yes. I didn't know that a lot of them went home and died the next week. I didn't know that. But I had seen a miracle, right? And who could possibly deny the power of the miracle? I considered it so lucky that I was born into the right family, in the right country, in the right religion, at the right time of history, because Jesus is coming any minute. And I get to be a soldier on the front line of that army at the last time. Think of the meaning it gave to my life. Think how it made me feel special. And of course, I always said I was humble and he was everything, but I got to go out and do all these things, and I saw a lot of success. Maybe a little bit due to my talents, but I think a lot due to just the gullibility of people that come to church. They want to hear things like that. I went to Azusa Pacific University. I got a degree in religion. I got A's and all that, but I didn't care about that stuff. I wanted to be out on the street preaching. I thought, in one more day, Jesus is going to come, and then I got to preach one more sermon to get the souls in before. I didn't think I was going to live long enough to graduate from college or get married. Or when I was in college, Hal Lindsey, the author of that prophetic book, The Late Great Planet Earth. And I think he's still on TV, isn't he, doing his thing? He assured us in about 1970 that the second coming of Jesus could not possibly be any later than the mid-1980s. And I remember thinking, that late? I have to wait until the mid-1980s before Jesus comes again? I did graduate. I got what amounted to a minor in Greek, so I could kind of impress simplistic people with a little bit of Greek, but I was no great scholar. And I became an associate pastor of 3 different churches. One was a Friends Church in California, which is sort of the West Coast Quakers, a little more evangelical. Richard Nixon came out of that tradition and did him a lot of good. Then I went back into more of my dad's sort of background into charismatic and into I went into an Assembly of God church, which are Pentecostal. And I liked that. I'm glad I was with that church for a year and a half. They were very sincere, very sweet, kind of simple people, very emotional, but way too noisy for my tastes. I got to tell you, have any of you ever been to those meetings where there's all of the slain in the Spirit and the speaking in tongues and the hallelujah and the women are shaking on the ground and you wonder what they're shaking from on the ground there, but their hands raised and faith healings, and I participated in some faith healings, and boy, I got to tell you, if any one of you had come up to me back then and started to question what I believed, I would just sort of smile, shake my head, and say, "You don't know. You don't know what I have. You can criticize all you want, but you're the one who has the problem, not me. I have this presence of Jesus, and it's real and it's powerful." I used to preach that you don't need those feelings to be saved, but I was one of those people that had those feelings. And I got to tell you, if you believe in this deity already, and then you have those feelings on top of that, it's such an affirmation. It's just such a, it's a gestalt thing that happens. Like, yes, it has to be true. I served about 2 years in Mexico as a missionary, trying to convert Catholics into Christians. And now I think about the arrogance of us American Protestant missionaries treating this poor lost country below the border as this dark mission field that needed our help, right? I wish I could go back there and apologize. Well, I did meet some Mexican humanists once, and I formally apologized to them, and they took it. So I feel like that they took my confession, basically. But one of the churches I was at then sent me out as a cross-country evangelist. I spent 8 years traveling the country thinking, any minute, Jesus is going to come again, any minute. And we lived by faith. And do you know what that means, to live by faith? It doesn't mean just to have faith. It means to live every day by faith. We had, all our stuff was in storage. I was married. We were having little babies by then. And no income, no contracts, no health insurance, just no money, traveling from church to church, hoping to collect enough of a love offering. We didn't even charge, hoping there was enough cash in the envelope to get to the next church before Jesus came again. It was that kind of thing. I did that for like 8 years. And a week of meetings fell through. I wrote a musical that I thought the children could perform back in California, but a Christian publisher snapped it up. It was called Mary Had a Little Lamb. It's for Christmas. Now, don't laugh. Those of you who have deep theological understanding will get this. Mary's the mother of Jesus. Jesus is the Lamb of God. Get it? Okay. And that musical became a bestseller for that company. It was Man of Music, to my surprise. And I thought it was the work of God. See, God was blessing my ministry. And they asked for a follow-up. So I wrote one for Easter. And you know what the title of that was? His fleece was white as snow. Because the final Passover sacrifice, Jesus was this type of the final Passover sacrifice, and his death would be the final sacrifice for the sins of humanity, but you had to bring the cleanest, purest, unblemished animal. So his fleece was white as snow. So that also was a bestseller for that company for a while. And what happened was kind of interesting. In my mid-20s then, my ministry started to shift. And Jesus kept on not coming again. You know, every day I would wake up, oh, there's another day. And I started getting invitations to preach and perform like a guest conductor and to do like preaching piano, kind of a musical preaching mixed together. I started getting invited by churches that were not always as fundamentalists as I thought they should be. There's a huge cross-section of Christianity, and for about 7 or 8 of those years that I was going across country, I was talking to pastors all over the continent, in the United States and Canada and Mexico, and I was shocked at some of the theology of some of these other Christian denominations. And there is no one Christianity, I realized. There's probably as many Christianities as there are Christians. And as I started talking to some of these more moderate ministers, I was surprised that they would think that Adam and Eve were not actually historical people. And I thought, how can you let them be members of your church if they don't believe that? And it started a process in my own mind of looking not at atheism. If you're raised the way I was, you don't just wake up one morning and go, oh, ha, ha, silly me, there's no God. Oh, how could I have been so stupid? I'm sorry. You don't do that. With me, it was this arduous process. It was a gradual thing, starting with meeting these other flavors of Christians. And what happened was, one of these early ministers told me, one of these ministers in the early part of that period told me that he thought Adam and Eve were historical, but some of the members of his church thought maybe they were metaphors. That just like Jesus made up a story, like the prodigal son, he made up parables, right? And it didn't matter if they were true. They were just parables that had an underlying moral message to them. So the early Israelites could have made up this parable about the early formation of the world and the human race. And it doesn't matter if Adam and Eve were true. It's the moral tale that matters. By the way, if you look up the word fable in the dictionary, it's described as a moral tale usually involving talking animals. Look it up. And I was shocked by that kind of talk. I thought, wait, this is heretical, because Genesis doesn't say it's a parable. Adam and Eve really existed 6,000 years ago, whenever that was. Maybe I was generous enough to say it might be 10,000 years, but somewhere in there, 6,000 to 10,000 years. And what happened in my mind was I didn't jettison Adam and Eve. What I did was I thought, okay, these people believe a little differently than I do, but that should not stop me from fellowshipping with these Christians who have a slightly different theology from me. Now, you might think that's silly. You might think, big deal, right? But to me, that was a huge leap to make. It was psychologically, and if I can borrow that word, spiritually even, quite traumatic to do that, because I was giving up something. If you're talking with a fundamentalist Christian like I used to be, keep something in mind. Have you ever talked with a fundamentalist and you wonder if you're talking the same language? Well, I'll tell you why. And not all Christians are like this, so I don't want to be accused of painting them all with the same brush. Many of them are moderate liberals and smarter and better than I was. But I was this fundamentalist, Bible-believing. The Bible is inerrant. It is true. The fundamentalist mindset is a binary brain. There's a verse in the Bible where Jesus said, I would that you would be cold or hot, because if you're lukewarm, I'll spit you out of my mouth. To us fundamentalists, there is no gray area. To a fundamentalist, there's no middle ground. It's either cold or hot, right or wrong, good or evil, yes or no. And if you are talking with a fundamentalist using terms that are relativistic or situational or counterfactual or conditional, which is how we live our lives, right? We live our lives in the gray area. But if you're talking to a fundamentalist with those gray terms, in their mind, it translates to black. It can't be gray. It has to be one or the other. I'm talking about the extreme fundamentalists, and that's the kind of person I was. I was really insecure about not having an answer. I was very, God is the God of the universe, and He created us all, and He's given us these clear words to live by, so it is the truth. Or this is absolutely wrong, and this is absolutely right. So when I said that I could still fellowship with other Christians who might have a slightly different theology from me, that was allowing a little bit of gray area. That was a little nudge towards tolerance, a little nudge away from having to be the guy who's always right. You know what I mean? And toward the end of this process that I went through, it took 4 or 5 years, I started to get embarrassed that I thought I was that guy who was always right, who had, or else if I didn't know the answer, that God had all the answers. It was sort of a humbling that is what happened. And later I got to thinking, well, after centuries of religious division and fights and wars and killings and doctrinal differences, I'm the guy who has it all figured out. I'm the man. Every denomination across this continuum, there's thousands of them, Christian sects. Every one of them can open the Bible and they can prove to you, here, look, read what it says in the Bible here. Look at this. Ours is the right one, and the rest are kind of off, right? They can all do that. Those of you who were raised in religion, couldn't your church do that? You could open the Bible. If you just read it right, we have the truth. And the others might be a little bit off, or they might be heretical even, or maybe not even Christians. It seems silly to you and me, but John Calvin had his friend and co-reformer, Michael Servetus, in the 16th century, burned at the stake. And you want to know what the argument was? Listen to this. Here's 2 different sentences, and you tell me the difference. John Calvin said, Jesus is the eternal Son of God. But Michael Servetus, his equally anti-Catholic, pro-reformer, Protestant friend, said, no, John, Jesus is the Son of the eternal God. Do you see it? That got him killed. He got killed. There's a wonderful book, Out of the Flames, and there's some other books about that story. And Calvin could have stopped it, but at the very end, Servetus, as he was dying, they used green wood so that the death would take longer. He screamed out, Jesus, have mercy on my soul, thou Son of the eternal God, right? And Calvin knew exactly what he was saying when he said that, so he slammed the window and let him die. Little things like that, doctrinal things. Calvin didn't want his authority questioned. He questioned the horrible crimes of the Catholic Church, but then he turned right around. When he got power, look what he did with it. Well, every denomination within Christianity can point to their truth and everybody else is kind of off. And I started seeing that as I was getting invited to all these different churches across this continuum of Christian theology. And Paul in the Bible wrote, God is not the author of confusion. But can you think of a single book that's caused more confusion than the Bible? And I realized that, do I have to be right? And these people that I met who were more moderate, they weren't bad people. They had good families. They were moral people. And most Christians are moral people. Most Muslims are. I've done 5 debates with Muslim scholars so far, and I'm really impressed with their integrity and the kindness of the people. And what happened was that it started a process in my mind, and I'm smart, and I kind of delayed my education. If I had gone to a real liberal arts college, maybe it would have happened earlier. I started finding myself hungry to learn, to figure it out. I'm preaching about the evils of humanism, but I didn't know what humanism was. I just knew it was evil. I started reading some things, and around about the age 30, I thought maybe I should learn a little bit about science and maybe a little philosophy and maybe read some history, maybe instead of just preaching the end of the world. My sermons started to change from less hellfire to more love. I became a little more of a moderate, less preparing for the afterlife and more how to live our daily lives now. It was just kind of standard fare in most mainstream Christian churches. How do we live our lives and deal with each other? And the afterlife, is a thief in the night. So, and I remember once I was preaching at a church in East Los Angeles, and I wish I'd had a camera. The whole platform, this pulpit and the platform, there's a huge wooden painted sign above it that says, Jesus is coming soon. It was that kind of a church. And I noticed up behind it, the paint was peeling and there were cobwebs off. Wouldn't that have been a photographer's dream to get that? But Jesus wasn't coming soon. And eventually, as I moved across the spectrum of kind of growing up organically on my own, nobody was preaching at me. There were no atheist evangelists on TV. When was the last time an atheist knocked on your front door, right? Nobody handed me literature on a street corner. I didn't read any atheist books. It was just me and my thoughts thinking about it, wondering and analyzing it. And eventually moved clear across that spectrum where I realized, if the prodigal son is a parable, and if Adam and Eve are a metaphor, then maybe God himself is just one huge figure of speech. Maybe the whole thing is just one, and why not? If you're going to say there's metaphor in the Bible, where do you draw that line? So I popped all the way across, and I'm making a very long story very, very short here, but I finally popped all the way across. In the summer of 1983, I realized I don't have any reason to believe any of this stuff. I loved it. I was good at it. I realized that there's no evidence for a God. There's no good arguments for a God. There's no coherent definition of a God. There's no good replies to the arguments against a God. There's no need for a God. I realized all that. And I became this sort of secret baby atheist in my own mind. And by the way, I know some other clergy who are preaching in the pulpit right now who are atheists and can't tell anybody. And I get emails from them, and they use pseudonyms. And by the way, Daniel Dennett is working on an article exactly about that. Atheists in the clergy who can't leave yet for one reason or another. And some of them are torturing themselves. And I went through a period of 4 or 5 months of hypocrisy where I kept preaching. I knew I didn't believe it, but how do you stop on a dime? I had a calendar with invitations to preach, and I wasn't making a lot of money, but it was still a life. And I tell in the book about the very last time I did a sermon music up at a church in Auburn, California, where they told me before the meeting that they were really happy because Harry was going to be there. And I said, "Who's Harry?" They said, "Harry's the town atheist." And you know the story of Pagliacci? He has to go up and perform, right? He has to pretend like he's happy when his heart's broken. Everybody said Harry just got remarried, and his young new wife became born again, and she said, "Harry, you like music, so come to church. It's just going to be mostly music." And everybody said, "We love Harry. He's a great guy. He's a respected businessman in town. He'd give you the shirt off his back. Everybody loves Harry, but he's not saved. He's an atheist." And I got to tell you, that was one of the hardest things in my entire life, to go up on that stage and to sing I almost stopped right in the middle and said, "This is crap." What would I have done? They hadn't yet given me my plane ticket home or anything. Would I just kind of walked out into the night? What would I have done? I just like forced myself. I just said, I can do this. Is show business. I can do this, right? And after the meeting, we went over to the pastor's house. This was December. And I was sitting by the Christmas tree, and there were some people invited, including Harry, whom I really couldn't even look at him. He was the first actual atheist, but I didn't even talk to him. I just sort of sat across the room. And the minister said, "Isn't it wonderful that we can all come together to celebrate the birth of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ?" And this voice across the room said, "Not all of us." And I thought, wow, those few little words that he said were much more sincere than all these hymns and sermons I had heard through my whole life. A real human being, unafraid to be different, speaking out, not fearful. The community's treating this guy like he has this disease or something. There's something wrong with him, but he seemed happy. So I vowed I would never do it again, and I never did preach again. I went home and wrote a letter to all my friends and relatives and said, "I'm not. Well, you can invite me to preach if you want, but it's going to be a different sermon now." That was January of 1984, and as I said, the first time I actually knowingly met and talked with any other atheist was when the Oprah Winfrey Show people called about 9 months later, and I met Ann Gaylor and Annie Laurie Gaylor, who were on that show as well. In fact, we have a videotape of the day we met, which is kind of cool. We showed our daughter, because Annie Laurie and I got married a few years later. And I could see how nervous I was to be in front of a hostile audience and preaching, and yet how relaxed I was that I had finally found something worth talking about. So that's a nutshell version of the story, and I think we might have time for a couple of questions. Who's going to do that? thank you.
Okay. People with questions? What can we see? At the top? Okay, let's start from the top up there. Please.
Hi, Don. I'm wondering, how do you talk to Christians without coming across as like you're talking down to them? Even if you disagree with their ideas and you think they're not as developed intellectually as you should be. I know, of course, let's be honest, we think we're smarter than other people. How do you get through to the resistance if you want to persuade them of another point of view or open their minds to another point of view, even if they don't change?
We can't assume that we're smarter than them. A lot of them are extremely brilliant. Well, I was one, and I was smart. I took some IQ tests that even surprised me, you know. And so it wasn't that I was dumb or stupid or unable to think. I think your point is that how do we dialogue without disrespect? And the way to do it is to respect them and honor the reasons why they believe. Why are you believing these things? If you had said to me, Dan, I can understand your feelings. Yes, those are very real. Those fears you have, your culture, all those things. And let's look at that. And instead of putting me down, building up the person. Nobody wants to be ridiculed, right? Everybody wants to feel respected and honored. I think there can be a small place for ridicule in the atheist movement, as long as that's not all we're doing. I mean, the people who come to your front door maybe deserve some ridicule, but and there's some people that maybe we know it's a waste of time to spend with them. But in general, if you had talked to me as a human being that you respect and you knew what I was feeling and going through, two things you could have said to me back then, and this doesn't apply to all Christians, it applies to fundamentalists. The Bible was very important to fundamentalists. If you had come back with a couple of examples of what's wrong with the Bible verses or that, now I'm not suggesting you all have to become Bible scholars, but all of you can learn a handful of things that you can say. The contradiction between the birth narratives of Matthew and Luke, for example, is a real good one. Point it out to them. And the second thing you could have done to make an impression on me, I wouldn't have converted right there, but morality, showing that non-believers put the lie to the claim from the pulpit that only God can make you good. As Peter was saying this morning, that the statistics all show that there's no need for a God to be a good moral person. And if you could show that you are contributing to charity, you're working in volunteer work, or whatever you're doing, contributing to the Richard Dawkins, what is it called? Non-belief relief, or whatever. That also impressed people like me. There are other arguments, of course, but for a fundamentalist, the Bible and morality are big issues.
We have time for one more question down the front.
Hi, Dan. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. It's been really interesting for me because I also was a born-again Christian. One thing I found very difficult is that Christians almost universally refuse to accept when you say you're an atheist that you ever were actually saved. I'm just wondering, how do you cope with that?
Yeah, and I go to great lengths in this book to show that if I was not a true believer, then nobody is. Because doesn't the Bible say you shall know them by their fruits? It doesn't matter what people think or say. You shall know them by their life. And I showed that my life had the fruits of the Christian life. And who are they then to judge whether I was or was not a true believer? A lot of them might say, we've heard talk about Hitler and Stalin, that Hitler wasn't a true Christian. Wouldn't it be just as silly for me to say, oh, well, then Stalin wasn't a true atheist, right? But if you use the talk like I've been using, I've confessed my sins, I believed in Jesus, I felt the Spirit, I saw what I were convinced were miracles and answers to prayer and all of that stuff. Affirm to them what they believe, right? Affirm it back to them. Yes, I know how you feel. I felt the same thing, and it's wonderful. And we're all different, of course, but for me it was just a wonderful, positive thing. So you're wrong to suggest that I was not a true believer or that you are not equally open to having your mind changed someday as well. Thanks.